Really nice to see you here this evening. The more people that come into the room, the warmer we get, and that'll counter the cold outside. And I mean that spiritually. Food is something to honor. Those of you who were here at the lecture that Ian Gawler gave a few months back will recall how we spoke in terms of food, the vegetational world, the animal world, at a spiritual level, deriving from a higher source than human beings. Many human beings are offended by this statement. How is it possible that a blade of grass is able, in some shape or form, to be spiritually superior to me? Well, just ask yourself the question. If you don't eat food, you won't survive, which means you need food. Food doesn't need you. That already gives us a clue that the spiritual nature of food does come from a high spiritual source. Tonight is not the night where Kabbalistically we explain how that is spiritually possible. But it is enough to tell us that we need to honor food because we're dependent on it, and it possesses a spiritual strength that we borrow from in order to be able to exercise our prowess in the world as such. And we honor our food in a number of ways. We make a bracha beforehand, a blessing, and the word bracha means we draw down a facility, a channel, and then we adopt a kavanah, a focused intention, that what we're going to do is elevate the soul spark of the food, and that will be carried out by the way that we use its energy. When we go out into the world and assist and help, act compassionately, under those circumstances we elevate the soul spark of the food. If God forbid we go out into the world and hurt, cheat, spoil, then what we have done is stolen the soul spark of the food and imprisoned it. So we are the leader of creation. Food is a channel for God's blessing. When we corrupt the food, our energy becomes corrupted, which means we become ill. It doesn't provide us with the correct quality and quantity of energy. And unfortunately, we're living in a world of commercialization of the production of the food line. And under those circumstances, we have to become very careful in terms of what we put into our mouths. In fact, the adage, buyer beware, should be always applied. But there's a lot of confusion in today's world as to what does quality of food today really mean, and how does it affect us? Because quite clearly the body is the medium for the soul to be able to express through, and when the body is unable to do so because it somehow is disempowered through hurt, through malfunction, because the food as such is no longer pure, then we're doing a disservice to our gifted self and to our inner selves. Tonight, we have a speaker of really great talent in the following regards. Not only is she a practicing medical practitioner, and therefore assisting a lot of people in the conventional medical fields, and very gifted in that regard, given her background, and she teaches students at university also on that basis. But she herself has taken a very specific interest in the holistic approach, the way that we understand the interrelationship between various aspects of our spiritual self, our physical self, and the material world as such. And therefore, in her own personal quest to ensure that health and wellness is maintained, she has really been able to gather a lot of information outside of the medical profession per se. Therefore, we're very, very fortunate in having Dr. Debbie Herbst with us this evening, and we look very much forward to her educating us so that tomorrow we will go into the world having eaten tonight's food And better still, tomorrow's food will be different than tonight's, no doubt. We'll be able to make a very real contribution. Debbie, thank you very much.
Thank you. Just like to thank Label for Menachem, who, whenever a speaker gets up, we have to disclose our, if we have any interest, if anyone's, we have any other interests that are bringing us here tonight. Menachem is my son-in-law. So, although I'm not being sponsored by anyone in particular, perhaps someone might think there's a conflict of it. Anyway, Menachem has asked me to speak, and Label, so I thank them very much for the opportunity. As Label mentioned, it is something that I have taken an interest, maybe perhaps in the last couple of years even more so, and it's something that I am quite passionate about and that I like to speak to my patients whenever I get the opportunity, or anyone else who cares to listen. Sometimes I think it gets a bit boring that I'm droning on, but some of the things that I'm speaking about tonight perhaps will be new information for some of you. Perhaps some of you have already heard it, but over the course of the evening we'll see. Hopefully we'll have some take-home messages with everyone can take on board whatever they want. But if I can impart that everyone perhaps takes on board and then goes and spreads some of the things that we're talking about tonight, then I'll think that we all take something home. All right. So the topic tonight as listed is whole foods that lift your mood. Simple changes for mind and body. When Label first spoke to me about speaking tonight, the course of lectures that have been happening over the last few weeks have been about change. So that's the tack that I'm taking, is more about change. What changes can we make? Are there small changes that each of us can take on? Are there small changes we can take home to our families, to people we come into contact with? And maybe I go a little too far with some of it, but I think that it is all upon each of us to go out and spread the message, if you like, of some of the things that we'll be talking about tonight. So I came up with a number of the questions that I'd like to answer over the course of the evening. The first of them is, why are we here? Why is everyone here tonight? We all, everyone has a different reason that we'll talk about it in a minute. I have my particular reasons, which I've stated. Everyone else has a different reason, I guess, so we can talk about that in a minute. The next question I'd like to tackle after we've dealt with that existential why are we here tonight is, where are we? What is actually the state of health? What is the state of nutrition? What are the nutritional guidelines that we're sort of living by that guide us, that most doctors will talk to you about, that most nutritionists will talk to you about if you go to a dietitian, wherever you end up being? What is the state of play? Following on that, I'd like to tackle, what do we want to change? Do we think that we need to change? Is there anything wrong with the current guidelines as we have them today, with the current guidelines that most of you would have heard about from your doctors and other health practitioners you may have come into contact with? Following that is, how do we do it? What do we need to do? What are the changes that we do, and how do we incorporate that into our daily lives? And then the last question, which I can answer probably right now, is when? When do we need to do them? And obviously the answer to that is, as we know, the famous saying, if not now, when? If not now is the time. There's no need to delay. All right. So where are we? The fact that everyone is here tonight sort of says, well, perhaps you're in some level motivated to change. Maybe you've come here just to hear what someone else has got to say. Perhaps the motivation might be that you might have some people here might have some physical symptoms. Health isn't optimum at the moment. The common things that people come to see me about: fatigue, low mood, low energy, I'm feeling tired, I'm feeling down, what can I do about it, doctor? These are very common things. Perhaps that's the motivation for being here. Perhaps some people feel actually quite well, but how can I enhance my health? What can I do to make my health or the health of my family even better than it currently is? The idea of optimal health, of always striving for something higher. Perhaps another motivator that might be bringing some of you here is, well, I've tried this, I've tried that, I've gone to this nutritionist, I've gone to that dietitian, they told me to try this, I didn't like that. So let's hear about something new. Lastly, I've listed there, well, maybe you've come here on previous the lectures in the series, so you thought, well, I'll finish it off. I enjoyed the previous one, so let's see what we've got to say about this. By the way, if anyone has any questions, feel free to just put up your hand and I'll try and deal with it. Okay. So this is, I'm not sure if a lot of people are aware of the stages of change model. This is a very commonly, is that clear? Yes. talked about where people are in stages of change. When we talk about changing anything, any particular behaviour or habits that we've got into, these are well-researched, tried and true. I'm sure some of you have heard of these changes, these stages before. So the first stage there is pre-contemplation. So when we talk, someone says to us change, like the topic of this series, change, a lot of times that evokes, fear. Why should I change? What's wrong? Why do I need to change? So a lot of times our immediate automatic response is sort of to go into denial. No, I don't need to change. Everything is fine, whether it's about food, smoking, eating, exercise, whatever it is. Our first sort of automatic response a lot of time is denial. And I could postulate or theorise that if you're here tonight, you can't really be totally in denial because you're here. On some level, you've come along, perhaps you've come along to argue, I don't know, so maybe there is an element of denial, but usually we're in that pre-contemplation. And the relevance of this is if someone is in pre-contemplation, if someone is in denial, it's very difficult to get them to change. As you can probably all relate to yourselves. If you're in denial, for example, a lot of people are in denial about smoking. When we talk to people about, well, everybody knows it's not healthy to smoke, right? But if they'll come up with, well, my grandfather lived till 96 and he smoked 20 cigarettes a day, and well, I know lots of people who are healthy and they smoke. They're in denial, and you can, probably when they're in that frame of mind, you can talk to you blue in the face. They're not interested in changing. But then the next stage comes along is we talk about ambivalence. Well, yes, my grandfather did live till 96, but I do hear this stuff, and well, yeah, maybe the doctor has a point. And if you get to someone when they're in that ambivalent stage where they're sort of thinking about it, well, you've got some sort of chance of getting them to maybe take on board what you've got to say. And that's perhaps where a lot of people are this evening. Perhaps well, yeah, maybe I could do a bit better. So you've come along to hear something new, maybe. Then the next step is determination or preparation. This is where really someone's thought about it. Either they've gone to a lecture, or they've been to their doctor, or they've decided it's New Year's resolution, and they're really ready. They're like, okay, let's go. I want to hear about it. And that's really a time to sort of capture someone's desire to change and to perhaps begin this process of education and what they can do about it. Then the next steps, as it says, action. Okay, I'm ready. I've learned. I know what I need to do. I'm ready to do it. I'm about to go out and do it. And then you get into like a maintenance where I'm living it. I've taken on board the changes and I feel really good. But then we know, as with most things, sometimes we relapse. And so this is really a sort of a cyclical thing. It's not just a linear, straightforward that people go from stage to stage. Often there's be relapse from one backwards and then we go forwards again. And there's been lots of research done how it takes people, a number of efforts sometimes. I'm sure you've all heard of people who have given up smoking. They've tried once, they tried twice, they tried 3 times. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they don't. But really, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, most people go through these sort of steps. So it all depends a little bit where you are at the moment in the stage of change as to how much you sort of will take on board, I guess, some of the things that we'll be talking about tonight. And the interesting thing actually for me as a doctor is that all these statistics get thrown at us all the time, but sometimes as doctors we don't bring up things with our patients a lot because we think that people are in the denial phase or people aren't really interested in hearing what we've got to say. But there's a lot of research saying that even if we shouldn't make those assumptions, and we should always try and talk about this stuff. So, for example, using opportunistic every time we see someone who's a smoker, of bringing up their smoking, even if we think they're in denial, because obviously the more that you chip away at it, the more likely they perhaps are to move on to the next stage. Okay, so then why am I here? I've discussed why some of you might be here. Why am I here? So my story. So I've written in inverted commas, just a GP. I think it's one of my banes of my life when people say you're just a GP. Now I'm not going to go on about what GPs are and why GPs are so crucial to the health system of Australia and everybody's health. But I sort of feel like GPs, and I talk, as Label mentioned, I do teach medical students as well as doctors in training to become GPs about the diversity of stuff that GPs can do. And it really is an honour and a privilege to be able to have, and I guess, try and have an effect. But it's really up to the individual GPs. I'm sure you can all tell, some GPs take a much more laid-back approach, some take a more conventional approach. But having said that, like I said, I'm just one voice, but hopefully we'll trickle away and make some small changes. So as it says there, I went through obviously conventional Western medicine training, and when I think about what that didn't include, it did not include a lot of information about diet, really. very briefly skipped over nutrition, and it was all obviously the conventional stuff that we'll be talking about, and it was really downplayed. So, most doctors really have had very, very little training at all in nutrition, and we've just sort of take on board the stuff that trickles down to us. So, like I said, I've made it one of my interests to try and learn more myself. Now, I don't know if any of you here would have heard Mark Cohen. He's spoken a number of times here. Yep. So I remember going, a number of years ago to a talk by Mark, and he really, I guess, was the first person to put this idea in my, aiming for optimal health. That as doctors, we're trained in people come, they're sick, we fix them, you go home, everyone's happy or not. But this idea of, no, that's not enough. It's not enough just to be such a knee-jerk reaction, reactive medicine. Someone comes with a problem, you fix it, they go home. But what about trying to aim for optimal health, doing more than that? So again, using every opportunity, not just, okay, you had whatever problem or illness you came to the doctor with and you fix it. What about trying to enhance people's health? And that's where we take a little bit, I know that the Eastern medicine is more, that is more the focus as opposed to the Western medical model. Hopefully things are changing a little bit. And that's a whole idea of complementary medicine, taking on board, not just saying, well, this is the track that I took and this is the track that I was trained in, but trying to take on board, from different disciplines. And following on from that, as a doctor, I feel that I can do better, and I feel as all doctors we can do better, rather than just saying, well, this is the way we were trained and that's what we were taught. We have to try and take on board these ideas of trying to optimise people's health. And the last thing I've seen there, following the guidelines that I was taught in university and that we've been trained in, it doesn't seem to be working. We've gone wrong somewhere. So that's some of the reasons, my motivations for being here tonight. And the why. Why am I here? As I said, just a trickle effect. If one drop of water has the ripple effect. So hopefully these are some of the things, some of the ideas that I'll be talking about are things that you might have started to hear about a little bit in the media and perhaps from other people. So we're all in this together. So the little drop effect tonight hopefully will have some bigger ripples. So there, to make some, as I said, make it one small drop at a time. Now, I've said there, I also feel this sort of a bit of a passion that I think there's been a lot of damage done, as Label perhaps mentioned, and I've alluded to. Some of the guidelines that we've been working with for the last 30 and 40 years are actually starting to be questioned a lot. So there's an element, I guess, of an apology. And people, it's labelled, you get bombarded all the time. Every day you open up the newspaper, there's another diet and another recommendation, and do this and do that and try this and try that. A lot of confusion, a lot of misinformation out there. So I think it's time to start, reversing that trend. And as I put there, a little quote from Einstein, who said, "Those who have the privilege to know have the duty to act." So I know a little bit. I'm not claiming to know a lot. It's just one of my interests. So we're all in it together to try and bring about some change. Another famous quote from Einstein that some of you may have heard. That the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result. And I feel that's where we have got to a little bit as medical practitioners and as health practitioners a little bit. We just keep on rehashing the same old recommendations, the same old dietary guidelines. It's not working. Why do we expect we're going to get a different outcome by just saying the same old things? It's time to change. Okay. So where are we? As I said, so the first question is why. I've sort of touched on a little bit, why are we here? Why am I here? Now we're moving on to where are we? What is actually the state of the nation in health terms? Is our health getting better? And I'm sure many of you can, well, compared to 100 years ago, yes, our health is better. We're at, record high life expectancy. It's certainly very different from 50 or 100 years ago. And yes, we can thank Western modern medicine for that. The advances in medicine, in antibiotics, in other medications, better healthcare. Yes, so on one hand, we're doing quite well. But on the other hand, I think the trend is starting to go backwards. We know that obesity is at record highs. And in Australia, I thought we were number 3, but apparently we're number 5, but rapidly rising. So it's really nothing to be too proud of in the rates of obesity, and particular childhood obesity, a project that I've been involved in over the last few years with the Royal Children's, trying to, how do we deal with childhood obesity? So, and it's really frightening, the rates of obesity. I'm sure this is something that everybody's heard. And keeping with that, diabetes also, that we'll talk about in a minute, the absolute epidemic that diabetes is currently at. Cardiovascular disease. So we thought that we're on the right track, right? We've got all these wonder drugs, cholesterol-lowering drugs, this drug, blood pressure drugs, all this cardiovascular disease should be getting better. And it has, a little bit, but not enough. It's still the number one cause of death, and it's really, we've got to question why. Again, that coming back to that insanity slide, we can't just keep on doing the same old thing and expecting things to change. The metabolic syndrome, this is tied in very much with obesity and diabetes, which is characterised by having obesity, having abnormal blood sugars, having high blood pressure, polycystic ovarian syndrome that I'm sure a lot of people have heard of. Why are all these things on the increase if we're supposedly getting healthier and smarter and better? Autoimmune disease, that's a really big one. Now, I've put in there that every day in Australia, this is really frightening, when we talk about diabetes and the epidemic of diabetes, we're usually talking about type 2 diabetes, which we're going to talk about in a minute, but actually the incidence of type 1 diabetes, of what we used to all call juvenile, early onset diabetes, which often strikes in childhood or in the teenage years, 6 cases are being diagnosed every day in Australia, 6 new cases, which is at record highs. And so, you know, people would be probably thinking, well, but we always thought type 1 diabetes is not related to type 2 diabetes. So what is that? What's going on? Why is there such this massive explosion of these autoimmune diseases, thyroid disorders? I'm sure many people here know someone or that have themselves have a thyroid problem, type 1 diabetes, all these other autoimmune diseases. So what's the story with that? Mental health disorders. Obviously, we all hear about this all the time, the number of children off with the psychologists and having all sorts of mental health disorders. And again, we read about all the time, you know, ongoing issues, and why you can speak to anyone who teaches in school. Why are there so many children with behavioural problems, mood disorders? And allergies and intolerances. This is something, you know, which I hear from older dogs. Oh, Amisha Gas, this is all silliness. What is this allergies? When I grew up, no one had a peanut allergy. When I grew up, you know, there was no such thing as nut-free zones in schools. Why is it? Is this really true? Is it just people are all going crazy and imagining that they've got all these allergies? Well, it's not. The incidence of allergies and intolerances is skyrocketing. And again, we've got to stop and question, why is this? If we're all giving the right dietary advice, what's going on? What's going wrong? So, a bit of a bleak, glum picture, but let's see if we can do something about it. So this was a cute little slide, okay, which I'll read in case it might be a bit blurry. So the patient says to the doctor, I don't feel well and I'm not sure why. So this is a sort of quite a common presentation that people come in, I'm feeling tired, I'm feeling down, I don't know what to do. So the doctor, being the good doctor, says, I want you to meditate for 30 minutes a day, because he'd come to Spiritgrow for a few sessions and he knows that that's what you're supposed to do. So meditate for 20 minutes, exercise for at least 30 minutes, avoid processed foods, eat plenty of organic fruit and veg, spend more time in nature and less indoors. Stop worrying about things you can't control, ditch your TV and come back in 3 weeks. Now, I don't know how many of you have doctors who tell you that, but maybe that's sort of something we can aim for. And that's, I guess, sort of sums up a little bit my approach and the approach that I take. You know, I will disclose, I do get quite a lot of visits from drug reps, 2 or 3 times a week, in fact. And a lot of times they're coming to talk to me about diabetes and blood pressure and diabetes and blood pressure, and it gets on, you know, goes on and on. If I see another rep talking about diabetes, I'll whatever, not very happy. And so, when they challenge me and say, well, do you prescribe this drug? And I say, no, actually I don't. They say, what do you mean you don't prescribe this drug? I say, no, I talk to my patients about their lifestyle. But yes, but doctor, but you know, they're all, is anyone here a drug rep? No. Anyway, they're usually young and very enthusiastic and just out of university, and they're very, you know, come with their big glossy things that they're supposed to try and talk to us about. And I say, no, I actually don't prescribe these drugs. I really try, you know, talk to my patients about change. Oh, but patients don't listen to you. They're not interested in that. I said, well, try them. So I keep getting, you know, that I'm going to get black banned somehow by the drug company. Sorry, yes.
I think the reluctance of the health industry to change is due to the fact that there really is no money for doctors or drug reps, you know, in this sort of scenario. You
got it, absolutely. The drugs make money, so that's what I'm saying. They'll stop coming to visit me because they'll realise there's no point. They're not selling. I'm not, you know, making them big money. And unfortunately, that's a harsh reality. And exactly, who's funding this type of stuff? Who's funding getting doctors to learn how to teach meditation? No one. So maybe Spiritgrow. All right. So diabetes and diabesity, it's getting lumped together now as one word, this diabesity epidemic, because we know there's this sort of intrinsic link between diabetes and obesity or overweight. And just in the medical journal that came last week, there was a whole feature on this, diabesity. What are we doing about it? What can we do about it? So just a few alarming statistics, and this is, we're talking about type 2 diabetes now, that 280 Australians develop it every day. Fastest growing chronic disease, 1 million Australians, but there's many who aren't diagnosed, so it's the tip of the iceberg, the ones that we do know about. To me, the most important thing is that up to 60, at the bottom line, up to 60% of cases can be prevented, and that's what I was talking about, why I don't just throw drugs at people, but that we can actually do something about it. 60 or probably even a high percentage in that we can actually do something. So I actually get really excited when someone comes to me with what we call pre-diabetes, which we'll talk about in a minute, because I say the ball is in your court. You can do something about this. If you leave it a few years, well, then we probably will have to resort maybe to the drugs, but we catch it at a time when you can do something about it. So that to me is exciting. I get excited because then I can talk to people about their lifestyle changes and what they can do. All right. Yes?
Do you see any difference between males and females with regards to how they change?
That's a good question. I probably see a lot more female patients. It's a bit hard to say. Well, stereotypically people will make the stereotypical comment that men don't come to the doctor until they're feeling really sick, and there is some truth in that. But occasionally I've had male patients who really take on board change. I guess I have the philosophy, if we have sort of mutual trust and respect, that people will listen and take things on board. But unfortunately, a lot of people just have, it's too late, diabetes, here, have drugs, don't talk to them about. So I guess I would say my male patients have take change on board as well as females, but like I said, I don't see enough men to make a whole judgment about it.
So if it's in the family, do they just take it as fake complete?
A lot of people do, exactly. My father had it, my grandmother had it, nothing I can do about it. Yep. And to some extent, there is some truth in that. It's very strong genetic markers for it, but it doesn't mean there's nothing you can do about it. Yep.
Just before you go further,
Yep.
why is it that 50 years ago then children didn't have nut allergies and peanut allergies and now they do?
Okay.
Why? All these food allergies. We didn't.
Okay. I'll answer it a little bit now and hopefully a little bit later. The basic theory behind that is that we're putting things into our bodies that our bodies are not designed to cope with and deal with. And because we're putting these, let's call them toxic substances, it's a very broad general thing, and I'll talk a little bit later about the more specific what is not good for our bodies, but because we're bombarding our bodies with things that it was never designed to be able to deal with in huge quantities, our body is turning against, and it's switching our immune systems on to fight things that it doesn't know what to do with, basically. That's the one theory. Specifically about nut allergies, there is another theory that because our environment is so hygienic, that children's immune systems are somehow, they're not fighting the germs, so they're fighting the proteins in certain foods. That's another theory. But these things are really on the increase. I prefer the first answer, because a lot of, especially with intolerances, even more than allergies, it's because our bodies are being bombarded with things and can't handle it, so they're bombarded with, sorry?
Maybe it's the way that the nuts are being processed, not the nuts itself, if you know what I'm trying to say. It's not
the foods are being
I
processed.
used to give my children, well, my son particularly, this was my first, pine nuts and sunflower seeds, and took them to kindergarten, and I was told, please don't do that anymore. Now he was 30, and I mean, well, they gave him a different sort of way of thinking, looking at different things that he could eat, which were healthy and nutritious all at the same time. Yeah. But the teachers have said, look, you might give it to someone else, and they might choke you, and it's
too much fear.
Yeah, and
And I'm sure you may or may not be aware that the current thinking now with allergies is to actually have early exposure. So 5 or 10 years ago, we were taught, and that to try and prevent allergies, you would prevent mothers from eating nuts and other very highly allergenic foods during pregnancy, and you would certainly avoid giving it to children till they're at least 1. Now the opposite is true. We give children a wide variety, as soon as they're eating solids, a wide variety of things, no avoidance of nuts, milk, wheat, anything. Things are not being avoided because then their immune system is learning to deal with it better.
I was accused of giving my son bird seed.
Yeah. Anyway, we can talk about a little bit about it later. All right. So I'm just going to talk briefly about, it can get very technical, all this stuff, but I thought it's important just to talk about it a little bit. So insulin. So when people hear the word insulin, they go, oh, diabetes, insulin. People who are diabetic need to have insulin. They'll, God forbid, they'll die if they don't get insulin. So we can't live without it. That is very true. We need insulin to live because the job of insulin is to get energy into our cells, very basically. And as it says there, it controls what our body does with the food that we eat, whether we burn it or store it. So when the whole system's working well, you eat food, your pancreas releases a certain amount of insulin to help transport the energy, fuel in that food into your cells so that you can live and function and do what you need to do. However, the system goes wrong, and it goes wrong a lot of the time. That's IR, stands for insulin resistance. So that happens when the cells actually say, I don't really like the message. So you've got food, you've got breaking down in your body, you get a release of insulin, the insulin's knocking on the door of the cell saying, let the food in, let the energy in, but the cell's sitting there going, I don't really want to let the energy in. So your pancreas thinks, this isn't working, I better make more insulin. So it cranks up and it starts making more and more insulin until such time the pancreas sort of runs out. It's like if you leave your car running on too long, what happens? The engine will die. So eventually it gets to a point where the pancreas can no longer keep up with the demand, the insulin runs out, and that's when you develop diabetes. The hallmark for that is too much sugar in your blood, too much energy in your blood. The energy is not getting stored inside your cells because there's either the insulin's run out or the insulin's not working properly anymore, and you develop diabetes. Now, the lag time between when a person first develops this, what we call insulin resistance, and developing diabetes is probably somewhere about 5 to 7 years. So as I said before, I get very excited when I see someone comes to me and they're complaining of some health thing and I say, I'm going to measure your insulin levels. Because if we just measure their sugar levels, they'll still be normal because the pancreas is still making insulin, this energy is still getting into the cells, but actually really the cells are insulin resistant. And the only reason the system's working is because the pancreas is working extra hard. So when we measure the insulin levels in their blood, they're actually elevated. And this tells us, the system's about to fail. We don't know exactly when it's going to fail, but at some point it will. So then that's when it's like, we can do something about it. It's before the diabetes develops. Just last week at work we had one of the head pathologists at Melbourne Pathology, Dr. Ken Sakaris, came to talk to us. Now, you probably couldn't get any more conventional medicine than that. He works in Melbourne Pathology, and he is very much of the belief, I talked to him about should we measure insulin levels. He actually said what I should be measuring, and what we should be measuring is triglyceride level. People who've had their cholesterol level know that one of the things that you measure when you have your cholesterol is the triglycerides. And he said if the triglycerides are more than 1.5, then the reference range from his own laboratory says they should be less than 2. But he says if it's over 1.5, someone has, by definition, has insulin resistance, which is a very interesting thing. Anyway, but so again, it's in this idea, let's try and catch people when the system is still working, when we can still do something about it. Okay, you'll see in a minute why I'm talking about this. Now, commonly we hear that people say, I'm doing everything right. I'm doing what the dietitian told me. I'm doing what the doctor told me. I'm exercising. I'm eating everything in moderation. I'm following the food pyramid, but I can't lose weight. Or I'm even putting on weight. So then this comes down to the question, are people people are either stupid, you don't listen, don't hear what the doctor or the nutritionist is telling you, you're lazy, not exercising enough, not doing the right thing, ignorant, just don't know the right information. So currently people think that what happens is people are either all of these things, stupid, ignorant, lazy, don't get it, don't get the message, you didn't listen to us enough, and so you eat too much, you put on weight, and it was always thought that this insulin resistance is a product of being overweight, that because we know when there's excess body fat, that's not so receptive to the insulin, and that's what insulin resistance is all about. So the answer to that is lose weight, right? But people say, but I'm doing all the right things. So again, we've got the message wrong and we just keep on pushing the same old. Now sometimes it does work and sometimes you can work really hard and it works and you lose weight and you can sort of fix the system up. But really what insulin resistance is it's about the cells saying, not listening to the message, or saying, I don't really want to store this, I don't really want to burn this, I want to store it. And what happens is this excess energy gets stored as fat, and you get more insulin resistance. So a current theory is that really what's happening is that our bodies are saying, we don't really like the fuel that's coming into our system, into our bodies, what I was talking a little bit about before, that we're putting too much of the wrong things into our bodies. And that somehow this insulin resistance is actually our body's trying to defend itself, trying to sort of stave off all this stuff that's coming in that shouldn't be coming in. So it's much more than just a matter of not exercising enough or eating too much, but it's really about eating the wrong things. And we know that there are certain foods that actually trigger this insulin response a lot more than others. And it's really foods, I'll preface this by saying people always use if you eat too much sugar, you'll get diabetes. And we always say, no, you can't get diabetes from eating too much sugar. And now I'm sort of the message might be, well, you can. But actually you can in the long term. All of us collectively can, not on an individual level, but on a collective level. That's the current thinking is that this insulin resistance is what's causing the obesity, not the other way around. And so what I've got there is that insulin resistance is the centre of the whole problem, and that's really what's causing the obesity. It's causing the metabolic syndrome. It's causing the cardiovascular disease, even cancer and Alzheimer's. There's a lot of work being done now in the relationship between diet and Alzheimer's disease. Obviously, diet and cancer. Interestingly, metformin, which is a very useful drug actually in diabetes, metformin is what we call an insulin sensitizer. It makes our bodies more sensitive to the insulin that we have. There's trials of using metformin in cancer. So when I saw that and I read that, I said, what's that telling us? That there's this link between insulin resistance, between the inflammation that causes and the end result of inflammation, which is cancer, to the point, like I said, that they're actually using a diabetes drug to treat cancer. So here in a sort of a bit of a diagrammatic way, we have what happens, we eat food. I'm going to classify that. It's not all food, actually. It doesn't happen when you eat fat, and it doesn't happen when you eat pure proteins. It happens when you eat any foods that contain sugars, starches in any form. What happens is, as I said before, your pancreas releases insulin to help transport the energy into the cell. But sometimes we've got the cells are saying, nah, I don't like that, or I'm not listening to that message, or I'm blocking that message. Some of the sugar gets stored as fat. When that happens, there's not enough energy in your system, so what happens? It tells you you're hungry. You need to eat again. And the system goes around and around. That's really sort of encapsulates what insulin resistance is. And in another form, we can say, well, what's wrong with a little bit of insulin? As I said before, we do need insulin to live, but insulin resistance is when the system has gone wrong. And the centre of it all is inflammation. There's a lot of evidence showing that insulin is a trigger of inflammation in the body, that certain sugar, in particular fructose-containing foods, trigger inflammation, trigger insulin resistance, and you can see all those things are sort of linked in some way, shape or form to this inflammatory change. Yes?
Inflammation, is that physical inflammation, that parts of you that are inflamed, or that?
No, maybe on a cellular level. Sometimes it will be. For example, in autoimmune, a lot of autoimmune diseases cause, joint and arthritic type changes. Sometimes it will be a physical inflammation, but sometimes it's more just on a cellular level. So this food pyramid that I've been talking about. So this is the classic food pyramid that we, have all been brought up with and still gets thrown around most places. So at the bottom of it, you see 6 to 11 servings of carbohydrate-rich foods. That's what we should be eating, and then fruits and veggies, bit of protein, and yes, on the top, yes, have a little bit of fat and oil. So this is what I'm sure you've all seen, you've heard, that's what the doctors tell you, eat this, and eat a bit of that in moderation. Okay. But where are we? As I said before, we're not really in a good state if we think about what I said before. But for the last 40 years, we've been told what the problem is fat. The problem is saturated fats. So we've been told, like the food pyramid says, eat lots of whole grains, your cereal, have sandwiches, lots of whole grains and starchy foods. Eat everything in moderation, have a bit of everything. And as I again alluded to in the beginning, that some of these guidelines are actually it's quite frightening, really, how the guidelines get developed and maintained. You know, you read the links between, for example, you know, Kellogg's. A lot of times the guidelines that will come to us from the Diabetes Association or the Osteoporosis Foundation, you'll see who the sponsors are. And surprise, surprise, it's Kellogg's, Nestle's, other big, you know, multinational food companies. And there's a lot of faulty evidence out there. It's very difficult to gather this evidence and to prove or disprove a lot of it. But unfortunately, like I said, really over the last 40 years, we've been still pushing the same barrel and still expecting things to change when in fact they're only getting worse. So yeah, that's where we are. We're in danger and we need to turn around. We need to do something different. Okay, so I've tried to simplify this as much as possible. What do we need to change? So the first one is processed food. Someone asked before, why are increase in allergies and intolerances? Why is there increase in autoimmune diseases? And I said sort of basically because the theory is that we're putting all these foods into us that we were never designed to eat. And really this advent of processed foods is relatively new when you think about how long we've been here, how long people have been here, with the foods that our grandparents and great-grandparents and all our ancestors were eating for hundreds and thousands of years is not what we're eating today. The food chain has dramatically changed in the last 50 years with the way foods are manufactured. So if you just think about that on a I like to try and keep it simple. To me, that makes sense. We've been around for a few thousand years. These type of foods have only been around for 40 or 50 years. Is it any surprise that we're developing all these diseases? It is any surprise all these intolerances and allergies and diabetes and obesity is developing when we've radically changed what we're doing to our bodies in the last very short amount of time? So with this idea of a lot of refined carbohydrates being pushed on us very heavily. Also, again, very recently, the idea of vegetable oils, up until 50 or 60 years ago, there was no such, it didn't exist. The making of oils out of different seeds and corn and canola and sunflower and so forth, the technology is quite new. So again, is it any surprise that when the consumption of these things has gone up, that it's also made massive changes to our health? And we know there's way excess of sugar. Sugar is one of those ubiquitous things. Every manufactured food item that you're going to pick up is going to have sugar in it of some way, shape or form. Okay, so the SAD diet. The SAD stands for the Standard American Diet, but we can say the Standard Australian Diet. So to my mind, simplistically, we're looking at it pretty simplistically, but I think that it makes sense is that that's the culprit. I know people will throw out, well, it's pollution, well, it's stress, well, it's this, well, it's that. Yes, all those things probably do have an element, responsible for some of the ills of our health, but I don't know, the food seems to be a major answer. As I said before, that we know that insulin, this whole idea of the insulin resistance is a cause of the problem, not an effect. So it's time we start shifting the blame. I was watching, Menachem mentioned before, TED. Does anyone here ever seen the TED presentations? Yeah, TED. I know, what does TED stand for? Stands for TED. Anyway, TED Talks. There's this, organisation in America, I guess, where they invite different people to come and speak. They have 10 or 15 minutes. People who are usually very passionate about their particular field, and there's a TED Health Talks. And last week I was watching a TED Talk from this. His name's Dr. Paediatric, who's one of at the forefront in leading the change of us as medical practitioners and changing the way that we look at these things. And he tells his story, he gets up and tells his story that he remembers when he was a junior doctor, that he went down to the emergency department and there was a lady there, a very overweight lady, who the question was, did they need to amputate? She had diabetes, and the question was, she had gangrene, and do they need to amputate her foot? And, and he looked at her pityingly, and he just, but said, well, he thought to himself, you've done this to yourself. It's all your fault. You ate too much. You didn't listen to the doctors. You didn't exercise enough. Look what you've done to yourself. That's the thinking that was going through his head. And then he said the next day he got called to a patient who had some type of cancer and was dying, and all he had for that person was pity. And then he said he started to think about why have we made these value judgments on people? And again, it all comes back to this: whose fault is it? Whose fault is it really that we've been all quick to blame the individual? You haven't listened to us. You don't listen to what we're telling you. It's all your fault. That we now need to start shifting the way that we're thinking. It's not about the individual not listening to the standard medical advice, especially when we're giving the wrong advice. Anyway, so that, as I mentioned before, someone mentioned, yes, genes also do play a role in insulin resistance. Some of us have inherited genes that make us more primed, our bodies more sensitive to the amount, different types of foods, in particular sugars and starches in our body, that might make us need to be even more wary of eating them. Age, everybody's level of insulin resistance goes up a little bit as you get older, and having a very sedentary lifestyle, which we all fall into the trap of. But really, it's got to do with the type of foods. So I've written there, eat real food. And someone, once said, anything that has a face, this might sound a little bit glib, anything that has a face or that grows in the ground and not in a packet, that's what you should be eating. So we can all go home now because it's all easy. But anyway, and the last thing is keep it simple. I do like to try and keep it simple. All right. So the first thing we're talking about in what we need to change is oils. And as I said, for the last 40 years, we've all been drummed into our heads this fat phobia, that fat's to blame. Very basic, people say, well, why is that? And very basically, in the late 50s and early 60s, when people started to be aware there's a lot more cardiovascular disease, what's the problem? And there's one person, one name that I'll mention, who is very largely responsible for this myth that we're starting to undo. His name was Ancel Keys, and he was a key investigator in America, and he was put in charge. He actually came up with the hypothesis that the more saturated fat that you eat, the higher your risk of developing high cholesterol levels and cardiovascular disease and dying from that. See, that was the hypothesis he started out. So he went about trying to prove it. So he did a study that was called the 22 country study, and he plotted the diets of people in 22 different countries and then plotted their risks of heart disease and cholesterol levels and all that. And what he showed was, well, he didn't like the results that he got. So he said, well, I'm not going to look at all 22 countries. I'm just because my hypothesis was to begin with that the more fat that you eat, the higher your risk of heart disease. So mainly saturated fat, animal fat. And so he said, well, I don't like the results, but these 6 countries, Australia, America, I think Canada, Mexico, I can't remember the other, anyway, they fit into it nicely because they all eat lots of fat and they've got high rates of heart disease. So I won't publish the 22 because it doesn't fit. I'll just publish 6. Anyway, he was on front of the Time magazine, 1961. I don't know the exact date. Cholesterol, and that was the first time this whole don't eat eggs because when you eat cholesterol, that's what causes heart disease and it's cholesterol's to blame, and don't eat saturated fat and eat all this wonderful margarine and manufactured oils, seed oils. They're fantastic. They're going to save the world. Don't eat animal fat. Don't eat eggs. Don't eat butter. And we've all been living with this, right? We all know, and every time I speak to someone, yes, my husband was in the hospital and he had a heart attack and they told him, don't eat eggs, don't eat butter, or go home, right? So, like I said, I'm taking some of the blame because I've been part of this, caught up in all of this as well. Anyway, so first of all, you can see his whole hypothesis was, well, he had a working hypothesis and he went about trying to prove it, but he was very dishonest in the way that he did it. And people jumped on the bandwagon, and I don't know if he won the Nobel Prize. Anyway, he was, Lord, and was all amazing, all fantastic. So we've been all working under this. Now, just a simple thing. 80% of the cholesterol in our body, 80% of the cholesterol is produced by our own livers. It has absolutely nothing to do with what you're eating. 20% of it is influenced by diet, but 80% of it has absolutely nothing to do with what you eat. That's number one. Number two, there's actually 50% of people who end up in hospital with heart attacks have normal cholesterol. So, and I was reading some stuff by some cardiologists who said, or cardiac surgeons who said, they're not sitting there, standing there, doing these open heart surgeries, and they see people with, who've been on cholesterol medication and done all the right things. Why are they lying there on the table with having heart attacks? It's this attempt to oversimplify the story. Just don't eat butter, don't eat more than 3 eggs a week and you'll be all good. It's not working. Like I said that thing before, it's insanity. The message is wrong, we're doing the wrong thing. Anyway, to try and get the message across simply, we've been eating this, too much of manufactured vegetable oils. If you think they're highly manufactured, the process to extract the oil out of them, to try and get them to go solid at room temperature, that was the whole hydrogenated fats, trans fats. At least they get starting, maybe those things aren't such a good idea. They're banned in a lot of food manufacturing now. But the whole idea of switching from animal fats to vegetable fats was probably one of the greatest errors that's been made in the last 40 or 50 years. Yes?
Can I just ask you, what about, with respect to heart disease, what about about with respect to cancer and saturated fats?
You're right, there have been some studies, I know, linking the intake of saturated fats and particularly animal fats to cancer. I think some of those are also starting to get a little bit more scrutinised now. And like I said, I like to try and keep it simple. Cancer is when cells have gone wrong, where there's been damage in the cells at some level, where there's been inflammatory change in the cells. We know that these things are highly pro-inflammatory. If we go back to basics, what our bodies were designed to eat seems to me to make more sense. Yep.
With the kashrut, the event of margarine became such an important thing, to put on bread, to put in cakes. If it wasn't for the kashrut, would we still using butter?
Would we? Most people have been told for the last 40 years butter's the devil.
No, but we just...
Maybe. There's good alternatives. Sheva, can I ask you this? We have a nutritionist in the audience. I know it's one of her passions. Just speak for a minute or two about fats and oils, if you don't mind.
There's so much to say, so do you want to just...
Okay, all right. If you want to add something in, though.
You use coconut oil.
Yes.
And the reason why saturated fat wouldn't cause cancer is because when the fat is saturated, it cannot go rancid. It can't go off. When you have an oil, there are three things that will create a carcinogenic environment. So heat, light, or air. And when you have oils that are sitting in the supermarket that they've all been heated, they're all usually in clear bottles, and they've probably been exposed there, so they're all rancid. So when you buy oil from the supermarket, you're basically buying carcinogenic oil. So when carcinogenic just means that it will cause like a cancerous environment in your body. When you buy saturated fat, butter, coconut oil, meat, that will never become carcinogenic, no matter how much it's heated, no matter how much light it's exposed to. So that's just the cancer question, if that clears things up. But I mean, I'm not as passionate as Debbie, so I can go on too.
Chicken schmaltz.
Chicken schmaltz, exactly. The only problem is, so everyone says, so all of a sudden you're saying we can eat chicken schmaltz, but you don't let us put it on our bread. That's the only problem. You can eat chicken schmaltz, it's just what you do with it.
Eat it straight.
Straight, no problem. All right. So just, as it says here, butter consumption at the turn of the century was 18 pounds. The use of vegetable oils was almost non-existent because they didn't have the manufacturing processes to be able to do it. I don't know what's happened with that slide. But cancer and heart disease were rare. Today, butter consumption is at just about 4 pounds per, this is in America. Vegetable oils through the roof, and cancer and heart disease are endemic. So I guess you can sort of make your own conclusions from that.
Can I ask you?
Yes.
Were they able to diagnose what was wrong with the patient, or they just said, it's a normal death because he died naturally, and they were maybe not able to diagnose that he had cancer or
In 100 years ago?
whatever. Like, they were used to people dying early.
Yes, because of infection. Most people died of infection or, yeah.
And so they never got to the stage to see how many did get cancer, how many did get harm.
You could argue that, but I'm sure people, all have great-great-grandparents who did live to an old age. That is one thing that people say, well, so they didn't know, they didn't die, they weren't able to die. And I'm sure cancer did exist, but not at the same rates as it does today. Might need some technical assistance here, Label.
Just refresh.
Let's just come up with this.
You want to still use the slide?
Yeah.
Then leave it.
Just leave it? Okay. All right. So I've got a slide here about what the good oils are, and we've already touched on it. So we know you've heard about omega-3s, and you probably maybe have gone to the doctor, even the cardiologist. A lot of cardiologists push omega-3s because there's a lot of evidence that omega-3 oils are very protective, reduce inflammation. So a lot of times people will get recommended to take omega-3s either as cardioprotective, heart protective. Also people with arthritis are recommended to take omega-3s because we know they're very anti-inflammatory. I know.
Omega-3, I mean, it's not clear.
I know. We're trying to...
It's not clear which
Maybe just through.
I don't know how they use the mouse.
We have an expert in the audience.
It's just saying we're not really worried about the internet connection. No.
Just take the cursor off of it to the Sorry. I managed to make it down here.
Yeah, if you slide that across, yeah. Yeah, mine won't run.
It's not on internet.
That won't slide?
I've called me up. This computer. Sorry, I've got the wrong slide.
No, we've lost it altogether. Yep. Maybe refresh. We're not on it. No.
Seems to be part of the screen.
Yeah.
You're not actually needing it.
No. Maybe, sorry?
Maybe can I get more full screen than what it is? And then
I don't know how.
What you need to do, you need to refresh the whole thing. So close this presentation
Yep.
and start it again.
Ah, that's it. Yeah, oh.
Roberto nearly had it. They'll fix it then.
Okay, so it's unrelated.
It's just the computer playing games.
Why is it off the
these
screen?
other ones, that's not the presentation.
You think it's related?
That's the presentation.
Skype? No. I don't see anything.
And if nothing else is open, hang on, if we go back.
Actually, try running the presentation again. Was it F5?
Turn off the wireless.
Why is it off the screen?
I don't know. Yep. Sorry for the technical.
There, USB device not recognized. That's the problem.
Onion USB because it's on a USB. That's what it's running on. Yeah.
How do you switch to this? Is this playing off your USB?
Yeah. We don't really need Windows Explorer though, do we? No, so you just close it and try again. No, don't play with it too much. All right, no.
I would just
Just close it down and just start again on that same page.
I would restart the computer.
Close the whole thing.
Just close your presentation down and then
Yep.
just root the program again onto the same page.
See, driver software installation is just going here. I don't know what this is.
You know something? Me too.
Start game.
Yeah, get rid of that. That's nothing to do with this.
Key and load it up. Will you be able to load it? Yeah, sure.
Sorry, is anyone, we're just getting to the good part.
Yes.
It does not matter, as long as you're here, type jar.
No name, I would say that's probably it.
You recognise it?
Yeah, whole moods. Yeah, that one. Okay, beautiful.
And just run the slide through.
Okay, now how do I switch?
Now, this one will probably be this.
The same. Okay, excellent.
Go down to it.
Is it on? Yep, beautiful. Thank you. Okay. All right, we're back after that brief interlude. Okay, so this is the slide that we're up to, talking about the balance between omega-3s and omega-6s. Omega-6 fat, as I said, everyone's probably heard about omega-3s being good for you, anti-inflammatory. Omega-6s are the opposite, they cause inflammation. And with the advent of all these vegetable and artificial manufactured oils, the whole balance of omega-3s and omega-6s has gone wrong. But if we stick to the fats that are listed there, butter, which is found in nature, olive oil that we know. The problem with olive oil is it gets denatured when it's heated too high. As Sheva mentioned, coconut oil is a solution, if you like, to all life's problems. It's parv, so we can use it in cooking, baking. You can put it on, if you want to spread it on something, maybe. It is very stable at high heat. It has a lot of anti-inflammatory properties. It has a high percentage of lauric acid, which is very helpful. A lot of people probably have heard, people use it for a variety of uses besides cooking, on your skin, in your mouth, for mouth sores and ulcers, people with reflux, heartburn, take it. Coconut oil is really one of the emerging good food stories. That little quote that I put in there, the Framingham study, some of you might have heard. Framingham is a town in Massachusetts, a very long-term study that's being done into heart disease, in cancer and diet. And a little comment there that they discovered, lo and behold, that as margarine consumption increased, heart attacks went up. As butter consumption increased, heart attacks declined. These things aren't, because this all goes against what's been espoused for the last 40 years, a lot of people don't come out, they don't divulge and disclose when they have these little anomalies that come up in these major, big-term, long-term studies. But people are starting to wake up and notice, and again, starting to say, wrong, as we said before, we're going wrong, let's turn around. Animal fats, chicken schmaltz, the fat that's found in the meat, these are the things that you should be eating. These are the fats that we should be incorporating into our diet, and conversely, we should be avoiding all seed and vegetable oils. Now, I said they're found everywhere. Any manufactured food that you choose to, eat probably has some of it in it. And for all this time, we've thought, oh, that's healthy. Oh, it's sunflower oil, safflower, oh, that's okay. But, sorry? No, no. All these are a lot of them have actually been genetically modified. Again, they've been, if you think about it, the process that, as we said before, to get them to be stable at room temperature, that they don't go bad, even though they are doing lots of bad, that you can live on the shelf for years and years. Just think about all the manufacturing, all the processes that have to go into them. Rice bran oil is also questionable. Sheva, any comments about rice bran and rapeseed oil? Sorry? Not a fan of either.
There you go, olive and coconut.
Yes. Stick with butter, olive, coconut, avocado. Macadamia, out of all the nut oils, macadamia nut oil.
You've mentioned a couple of times now about genetic modification.
Yes.
We've moved from genetically modifying plants
Yep.
to genetically modifying more complex food types.
Yes.
Is that to suggest that as this becomes more and more prevalent, the same problems will present as a result of that as are being attributed to the genetically modified plants?
I think the genetically modified is a bandwagon that everyone's hopping on. It's a bit of an oversimplification because none of these things that I'm talking about really actually involve genetic modification. These are all things that have happened sort of since the 50s and 60s. We'll talk about it in a minute about the wheat, and people say, oh, it's because it's been genetically modified. Genetic modification is something newer, and you're right, that's got a whole host of problems itself, but not necessarily the things that I've been talking about so much. Okay, so that's a bit about, yes?
Seed oil, but how about just seeds? Like,
yeah, seeds are fine in their natural state. They're actually good.
like you have in muesli.
Yeah, seeds are good. It's when you do something to it and mess with it and try and get it to be stable so it looks nice in the bottle. And
Flaxseed oil is out. What about fish oil?
fish oil is good.
But flaxseed oil is out.
Flaxseed oil. I think in small quantities flaxseed oil is okay. Drown to cleaner is great because it's just you're grinding up the sesame seeds.
What could you use instead of grapeseed oil? Because I use it.
Olive.
So what makes olive oil okay as a vegetable?
Because olive is just extracting, it's for you taking a fruit, an olive, and you're extracting an oil.
Which one is fish?
Fish oil is omega-3, very high in omega-3 oils.
So what's 6?
There's a balance. There's a bit of omega-6 in all fats, but it's the balance. So in the seeds and the plant oils, they've got much higher ratio of omega-6 to omega-3, whereas something like fish oils, have way. The ratio is supposed to be about six times the amount of omega-3 to the amount of omega-6, and in all these plant and seed oils, they're 1-to-1. They've got equal amount of omega-3 and omega-6.
3 or 6?
3. It's about the balance. You need a bit of 6. You do need a bit of 6, but you should be having about 6 times the amount of 3 as you are 6.
Which is 6? There's 6 things, is there?
No. It's omega-6. There's different omega. It's got the chains of the fats and the chemical structure.
Question maybe with nutritionists.
Yes. Sorry, Sheva. She's going to kill me.
Sorry, if you're taking like a fish oil and you take it not in its pure form, like the oil, but in a capsule and it's coated, how does that break down in your body? Do you just sort of dispense with the coat, just go straight for the oil rather than the capsule? Because capsules are just easy if you're travelling, you just take them with you. Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder because it's sort of, that is a plastic coating, it feels like.
It's not plastic.
It's not beef, it's some kind of...
Some of them will be gelatin, but they're inert. It doesn't do anything. It just breaks down in your body and the oil releases. It's just making it in a transportable way instead of having to take a bottle. Yep. Almond oil. Almonds are good in the natural state. I don't know much about when they extract the oil. Sheva, do you know anything about almond oil?
As a general rule, olive oil is monounsaturated, so it's different to every other oil. All the other oils are polyunsaturated. The difference is monounsaturated means there's one hydrogen, one carbon that's missing a hydrogen, whereas polyunsaturated, which is every other oil that you're asking about, is polyunsaturated. So there are many carbons that are missing hydrogen. When you expose it to heat, light, or air, the oxygen can react to every carbon that is missing a hydrogen. So in a monounsaturated, there's only one place where oxygen can react. In a polyunsaturated, there are many places that oxygen can react. When oxygen reacts, that is when the carcinogenic reaction takes place. So when you ask yourself, is it a good oil, say, what type of oil is it? Is it polyunsaturated? If it is, and I would like to eat it, then you should buy it in a dark bottle, keep it cold, closed, and try not to heat it. If it's a monounsaturated like olive, then again, you don't need to keep it as cold. You should get it in a dark bottle, but you can heat it occasionally. Try not to, that often. If it's a saturated, you can do whatever you'd like.
Thank you. Yeah, it starts to get very technical about, but again, this is the thing that we've been ingrained in polyunsaturated, margarine and all that, and that hopefully is a good explanation why that they're not healthy. Yes. Avocado oil is fine.
Avocado is olive.
No, it's avocado. Yes. One more before we move on.
Do oils have a limited shelf life?
Well, saturated. Do oils have a limited shelf life? Yes.
Polyunsaturated should not be on the shelf. It should be in the fridge.
But even in a fridge, is there a limit?
Yeah, probably like a couple months, depending. Flaxo would be a couple weeks, and then
Because I'm sure a lot of people think that
But
oils
saturated-
last forever.
Coconut will last.
Coconut years and years. Coconut oil will last in the pantry. All right, let's move on because there's a bit more. The next topic is what else do we need to change? Wheat. Now, I must admit, when I first started being interested in this, as I mentioned, but often my patients say they went to the naturopath or they went, somewhere else, and they seem to come back with this generic prescription. Don't eat wheat, don't eat wheat, don't eat sugar, don't eat wheat. And I'm thinking, come on, we all eat wheat. What's wrong with wheat? Wheat's fine. And then I'm thinking, well, our forefathers, ate wheat. We hear about wheat in the Chumash in the Bible in the times of the Beit HaMikdash. Wheat was very integral to our life. How can I be saying there's something wrong with wheat? But then you start to do a little bit more research. You say, well, is the wheat that we're eating today the same as the wheat in ancient times? And then we can ask another question, is the wheat that we're eating today actually the same that our grandparents ate even 100 years ago? And then we can even say, is the wheat that we're eating today the same that we were eating 40 or 50 years ago? And the answer to all those things is no, 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 and no. And this is where people start to go, oh, you mean it's been genetically modified? It's not that it's been genetically modified. Basically what happened, and most of us in here, a lot of us can remember the times, I certainly remember, in the 60s and the 70s, we were talking about population explosion, the world's going to starve to death, how are we going to feed all these people, everyone's going to starve. And the quest was on how could they come and make crops that could feed the starving people in Africa and Asia. So there were, the challenge was on to the scientists to develop crops that would grow easily and would be able to grow in the wildest of conditions, wouldn't need a lot of water, that anyone could grow them. So what happened was they crossbred, it's not genetically modified, they crossbred multiple different types of wheat and came up with a totally different variety of wheat. Now the wheat that we have today has a much higher gluten content. People talk about gluten intolerance and celiac, we'll talk about in a minute, but it actually has something else called gliadin. So we know, yes, there is a certain small set of the population who actually are totally gluten intolerant, and that's what celiac disease is. But nearly all of us are gliadin intolerant and to some degree also gluten intolerant. And certainly this new type of wheat that we eat today bears no relationship to the wheat, certainly of the times of our forefathers, certainly in the times of in ancient Israel and within the Beit HaMikdash, bears no relation. And it bears very little relation even to the wheat that our grandparents were eating 100 years ago. So that, in summary, is what is the problem with wheat and why when people say, oh, what's wrong with wheat? We all eat it. The other thing is, as I mentioned before, we eat way too much of it. Okay, as I said to you, the wheat that we're sold today bears nothing, it's no relation to the wheat of our grandmother's age, of the earlier 20th century, and certainly nothing to do with the wheat in the Bible. And that's just, it says because the plant breeders changed it in dramatic ways. It used to be 4 feet tall, now it's 2 feet tall, it's much thicker, much easier to grow, doesn't go bad. And and so someone says, well, why don't we change back? And apparently the patent for the wheat, it's very hard to actually get new wheat. It's all one source or a few major sources. Now, this stuff is quoted by, there's a fellow in America called Dr. William Davis, who's a cardiologist, who's very, he wrote a book called The Wheat Belly, and what the problem with wheat is. Hang on, just to go back very quickly. So people talk about celiac disease. Now, again, we talk to people, a little older doctors, and, again, Michigan, what's this celiac disease? I never heard of celiac disease. Why does every second person have celiac disease and can't eat wheat? It's a real phenomenon. It's not an imagined thing that more and more people are actually gluten intolerant. And how do we know this? And we actually know this. Some research is good that when we take blood samples, actually keep a small amount of samples of serum from going back years and years. So we actually do have samples of serum that was taken in the 40s and the 50s. So people interested in this said, well, let's go back and we can check in somebody's blood if they have these antibodies to gliadin and gluten and see, was celiac disease around then and we just didn't know about it. What they've actually found is there's been a 7-fold increase in the incidence of celiac disease from the late 40s till today. So again, that says why? If the wheat that we're eating the same, why is these things happening? Celiac would be classed as an autoimmune disease. It's an intolerance, not being able to break it down and digest it. So these things are real. So our bodies are telling us something, that these diseases are, increasing incidence, that we're doing something wrong.
Just before we go on to sugar, what is gliadin?
Gliadin is a protein coating of the wheat. Some of these things, if you read some of this stuff, these things, the animals won't eat it. It's actually poison, actually toxic. It causes inflammatory and toxic change. It's sort of a coating on the outside of the wheat to keep it strong, but we're putting it into our body. So, some of these people, what it does to your insides and the inflammation, the inflammatory change, even people who say, yes, I can eat wheat all day and don't feel sick, it is doing bad damage, causing... Spelt has a much lower gluten content than wheat. Spelt is considered an ancient wheat. Spelt is a lot easier to digest and has a lot lower gluten content. Yes. Not to the same extent, no. What? Rye also has quite a high gluten content. Yes. Exactly, just eat quinoa. It's easy. Quinoa. Okay, moving on. What is the sugars? What's wrong with sugars? There's a lot of evidence. So we talk about fructose. Now, fructose is a bigger issue in America than it is here because, again, you might say, all the conspiracy theories, but in the 60s when Nixon was, things were going really bad in Vietnam and the farmers were all complaining and he had to come up with some solutions to keep everyone happy, and corn was seen as the saviour for Nixon, and there's all these stories about what he did to the farm, made these huge co-ops and increased the corn production, and then they had, what are we going to do with all this corn? So they developed the process to be able to extract corn, high fructose corn syrup from out of the corn, and he won over the farmers and all sorts of stuff. Anyway, so they started corn syrup is a very, very cheap form of sweetener. It's much, much sweeter than glucose. So in America, high fructose corn syrup is in just about every single manufactured product. I should probably be a little bit embarrassed to say, but we'll disclose. My husband likes Coke, and he doesn't drink Coke so much anymore, and he can tell the difference if you drink Coke in Australia and in America, because in America it's got fructose in Australia it's got sugar, cane sugar, and some people who are very sensitive to that can tell the difference. And interestingly, that's why when they make Coke for Pesach, there's no Pesach Coke in America, because in America it comes from corn syrup. So the Pesach Coke comes from Israel. Anyway, fructose is a major problem. It's everywhere. It's in all manufactured foods. A bit less in Australia. When this doctor came to speak to us last week, Dr. Sakaris, I said that's why Australia is only number 3 or 5 in the obesity. America's number 1 because we don't have as much high fructose corn syrup as they do. But anyway, so fructose is everywhere. It's considered to be a cause of a lot of things: diabetes, hypertension, depression, cardiovascular disease, fatty liver. And this is based on the science behind this is when you eat fructose, as opposed to glucose, it's absorbed directly into the liver. It's not the same when you eat something that's broken down into glucose, that, like we said before, the pancreas makes insulin and it goes into the cell. If there's excess, it gets stored as fat. That doesn't happen to fructose. Fructose gets directly taken into the liver. And again, we're not designed to be able to be dealing with so much fructose in our systems. And then I put in a thing, ignore fructose in fruit. We'll talk about it in a minute, because fruit is high in fructose, but that's not really the issue. So just to summarise, most of the carbohydrates we eat are made up of chains of glucose. As I said before, when glucose enters the bloodstream, the body releases insulin to help regulate it. Fructose, however, goes straight into the liver. And then when too much fructose, the liver can't process it fast enough, so the body actually turns it into fat, and then it goes into the bloodstream as triglycerides, which we mentioned before. If you'll think back before, why I said triglycerides, having too much triglycerides in our blood is a hallmark of the beginning of insulin resistance and the very beginnings of diabetes, not just a cholesterol problem, which a lot of people think. Yes?
What else is fructose in?
What else is fructose in? Fructose, well, in manufactured things, they use it as a sweetener. Table sugar is 50% fructose. So there's fructose in table sugar. Fruit is high in fructose in varying degrees. That's naturally occurring fructose.
That's okay?
Yes, we'll see in a minute. As I say here, it's almost impossible to overdose on fructose that we find in fruit. And vegetables, there's fructose in a lot of vegetables, and the reason is because they also have a lot of fibre in them. So you very rarely find somebody who gets too much fructose in the system because they eat too much fruit and vegetables, as opposed to people who drink soft drinks and juice. Because you could drink, 5 cups of apple juice quite easily and you're getting a huge amount of fructose into your system. But find me someone who can eat 5 apples all at once, or there's probably even the equivalent of more than 5 apples in 5 glasses of juice. So it's really, the problem is, as we know, too much reliance on soft drinks, juice, so it's in soft drinks, it's in tomato sauce, fructose is everywhere.
What about freshly squeezed juice? Because a lot of people say, well, that's different.
Why? It's still got a lot of fructose. It's still a lot of sugar. And the problem with juice is, if you're having a little bit of it, it's all right, but it's very easy to have a lot of it. The number one take-home message for trying to combat childhood obesity is to get rid of fruit juice and get them to only drink water. Anyway, perhaps a lot of people are coming around to think perhaps fructose is the real culprit in the cause of the diabetes epidemic. But then I'll put there's a lot of hype, and you'll go into this. Some people, we're unfairly blaming fructose. It's not just fructose. The problem is, yes, maybe they're right. It's too much sugar altogether, full stop. It's too much sugars, too much refined sugars. We can, it can be a lot of academic debate if it's the fructose or the glucose, but too much of any of it is not good. So just to try and summarise, I know I sort of sped up at the end, to try and keep it simple. So keep it simple, and in the S is stupid, that we have to try and really keep it simple. If you buy food that's only got one ingredient list in it...
It's impossible to buy food with one ingredient.
An apple.
Oh.
A steak. A banana. That's what I mean. One ingredient in the list. We're trying to keep it very simple. One ingredient in the list. As I said before, does it have a face? Was it once connected to the ground? Then it's okay to eat it. Can our bodies tolerate it? One of my favourite things I talk to people is stick to the perimeter of the supermarket. The more that you get into the middle of the supermarket, the more you get into more highly processed manufactured foods, the longer the list of the ingredients, the more high fructose corn syrup, the more artificial sugars, seed oils, the more that you delve. So try and stick to the perimeter. You'll notice the fresh fruit and vegetables, the proteins, the fish, is all on the perimeter of the supermarket. Try to avoid the middle aisles as much as possible. We're trying to keep it very simple. Eat less sugar. Someone said that supermarkets are sugar central. That's what you're going to find in supermarkets. Sugar. Everything has sugar in it in one form or another. Another thing that I like to quote is that breakfast cereal is not food. Those things that come in boxes, cornflakes, rice bubbles, it's not food. It's manufactured things put together. It's got lots of sugar. They've usually got seed oils in it. If you want to eat that stuff, eat the real thing. Eat the oats. But anyway, oats are fine. Again, if you notice how big, when we used to go to America, I used to, like walking up and down this supermarket aisle, seeing how big and long that cereal aisle is. But it's happening here too now. The cereal aisle goes from one end of the supermarket to the other. As someone said before, I said we should be eating less grains, and with the grains that we're eating, choosing the lower gluten options because, so quinoa, rice, buckwheat, there's plenty of alternatives. Choosing only the good oils, as we mentioned, and water should be the only thing that we drink.
They're saying grain bread is bad.
Wheat. To overindulge. I didn't mention before, one of the problems is that when all this stuff has been these health guidelines, so if they're saying, well, you should be eating, 40 or 50 years ago, don't eat so much meat, don't eat eggs, don't eat this, well, what were people eating? So a lot of it got shifted to grains. Like I said, we eat cereal for more in the breakfast, sandwiches for dinner, pasta for, sandwiches in the middle of the day, pasta at night time. 6 to 11 serves of grain-based food a day is way too much.
What about eggs?
Eggs are good.
Okay.
So that's the problem, that when they shifted and said don't be eating meat, well, people started thinking, well, grains and whole grains in particular are good for you, but we've taken the message too far.
Are you maintaining then that it's not such a bad thing to eat meat, red meat?
Not at all.
Not at all?
No, meat is good. If it's got a face. It had a face before you ate it.
But what if you're an animal lover,
Soy-based products.
Okay, yes, I have not touched on soy-based products, and that's a good question, but it's too much for today. But there is actually trying to turn against, we're probably overindulged in soy as well. A little bit. Soy in moderation is okay, but not overdoing it. That's another topic.
Pesach menu is the way to go.
Absolutely, you got it. That's it. Eating Pesach all year round. Without the matzah, exactly. And I will tell you, that's actually not such a funny comment, but it's actually a very sad, reminds me of a sad comment. I have a diabetes educator. We have a diabetes educator in our practice who sees our diabetic patients to talk to them about what they should be eating, and she talks about the pyramid and do this and do that, blah, blah. Anyway, after Pesach, so she sees quite a few patients before Pesach and after Pesach. Lo and behold, they come back after, these are people who don't like matzah that much, come back after Pesach and their blood sugars are better and they've lost weight and they're looking better. So I talk about this stuff with her quite a lot at work, and I said to her, well, you know, that's funny, isn't it? They've been eating less grains for the last week because there's none of the other stuff that they're normally eating, and their blood sugars are better and they're better. What do you think that says to you? I won't say her name, what her name is. And she goes, yeah, I know that. I said, well, why don't you tell people to do that all the time? I'll get a bit emotional. Do you know what she said? It'll be bad for business. Yep.
What about sourdough breads?
If you are going to eat breads, yes, sourdough breads are better. Yes. Dairy, some people are intolerant of dairy. If you're tolerant of dairy, dairy is good. And full cream dairy, not low fat. We didn't go into the whole low fat skim milk. Sorry, I'm turning everything you've ever heard on its head. That's another talk. The soy and the full cream dairy. Real milk. But a lot of people talk about it should be pasteurised. The cows shouldn't be eating grains either. It's a complicated topic. But dairy is okay. As it says there, don't eat anything that your grandmother wouldn't have recognised as food. Our grandparents didn't go in to buy boxes and boxes of things. Anything that can live... Actually, he's read something, the longer that something can stay on the shelf, the less you should be eating it, or something along those lines. In other words, the longer it lasts in your cupboard, you shouldn't be eating it. And if you'll extrapolate from all the things we're saying, meat, eggs, olives, avocados, these things aren't going to keep for months and months in your house. So that tells... That's a problem.
It's got to be kept in the fridge, don't eat it.
All right, so this is the new... Salt in moderation is okay.
Salt in kosher meat.
Salt is not necessarily bad for everyone. Not necessarily bad. Yes.
Brown sugar, is that any better?
No. Same thing. Exact same thing. Raw sugar the same.
What about stevia?
Stevia is a plant-based sweetener, which at the moment, yes, is looking promising. Good.
About this year. Brands like Natvia that combine stevia with
Well, some people say you should bet stevia. It's way better than eating sugar. Okay, so this is what the food pyramid should look like. So down the bottom, based on some of the things we've been talking about, meat, fish, fowl and eggs should be on the bottom. So replace that 6 to 11 serves of carbohydrate food, lots and lots of vegetable. Healthy fats appears avocados, coconut, olive, macadamias, moderation foods, fruit. Again, depending on your tolerance levels. The best fruits to be eaten are the ones that are in season. This is a whole other topic about eating things that are out of season. Anyway, berries are very good for you. They've got lots of antioxidants in them and are relatively lower in fructose than other fruits. Dairy, it says they're high fat. Starchy tubers, that means things like sweet potato, yams, quinoa, wild rice, other nuts, seeds, nut butters. And on top we have, it's a bit hard to read, herbs, spices. These are just things, not because they're bad for you, but these are the things they use as supplements. Not because you need to eat them in moderation, it's just you don't eat a lot of them. So we've just turned the food pyramid basically sort of upside down, somewhat. I could get you one. Okay. All right. And I think that just about brings us to the end, and that's all our vegetable friends thanking everyone for coming. And just if you want some more readings, these are some of the things, but you can ask me later about some interesting places to go for more information. Thank you.
Do you want me to tell them where you practice?
Well, I don't know what you were expecting. We have one of the most grounded, level-headed medical practitioners presentation I've ever heard. Revolutionary as it was, one of the things that we've actually discovered is that all the so-called conventional wisdoms that we've been raised with are not necessarily wise. We've also heard it's not because they were wrong, but it's because the manufacturing and growing processes have changed. And because they have changed, we need to change, which is why we have this theme of change. And the way we need to change is we become much more literate about food. Now that's not being food conscious in an over bearing way. What it really means is that what we put into our body significantly affects our body. We have to recognise that. It was sort of like, it's like the elephant in the room when we go and eat out at a restaurant or somewhere else. We just completely negate that notion. But the truth obviously is that what we put into our bodies severely affects adversely if it's unhealthy. And perhaps somewhere down the track we'll discover the cause-effect relationship much more closely. There are suspicions, we've heard some of the suspicions today, and what we've heard is that we really do have to change our approach to what is healthy and what is not healthy. Well, this has almost completed the series on change. We have one more lecture. It's actually not a lecture, it's actually a table discussion on Wednesday on the issue of change. It'll be on climate change, political change, and personal change. And Menachem and I are going to be presenting this at opposite ends of the table. So if you want to have an entertaining evening, feel free to come along on Wednesday evening. Talia, somewhere behind you is a little package which I want to present to our speaker this evening. Thank you very much. My granddaughter Talia is visiting from Israel and now she's got a job to do. Thank you very much. So Debbie, just a very small token of our appreciation. We thank you very, very much for spending an evening with us. We have the very good fortune, being Mechutonim, to have the benefit of Debbie's advice in an ongoing manner. But I've no doubt that many of you might want to discover more of what Debbie has to say. And she works from the Inkerman Medical Practice, corner Inkerman Road and Hotham Street. You can make an appointment there if you so desire. And I look forward to having you with us again shortly, and get ready for the next series. The next series is going to be in August. It's going to be on spiritual intimacy and effective relationships. So if you're interested in anything along those lines, watch out for that. Thank you very much for the evening that you contributed.